Welcome back to Economic Outlook. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the airline industry. First, we'll look at a summary of why airlines have become so unprofitable over the past 5 years. Next, we'll look at two strategies airlines employ to try to remain viable in the face of volatile fuel prices. The first strategy is consolidation through mergers and acquisitions, and the second is through fuel hedging. Next, we'll look at how bad publicity has exacerbated the airline's problems with consumers. And finally, we'll take a look to the future to see what airlines can do to try to return to profitability even with oil prices as high as they are today. As we saw in our previous discussions, the root cause of airlines' profitability problems rests with the legacy carriers' responses to deregulation. Before deregulation, the legacy carriers competed with one another for dominance over their respective hubs. However, after deregulation, new low-cost carriers were able to enter the market and compete directly on price. The legacy carriers' business model was really a relic of the days when aviation was governed by the Civil Aeronautics Board. Low-cost carriers were designed from the ground up to compete on price, and they avoided expenses by flying point-to-point routes and avoiding the hub-and-spoke system that the legacy carriers had used since before deregulation. Even though they operated under completely different business models, legacy carriers tried to offer the same prices as their low-cost competition. The only way they could do this was by increasing the volume and breadth of services they offered. In 2007, U.S. Airlines set a record by transporting more than 770 million domestic and international passengers. If ticket prices remain where they are today, the FAA expects this number to grow to over 1 billion passengers by 2021. Much of the increased demand spawned by low ticket prices came from smaller regional airports. In turn, this caused legacy carriers to purchase regional jets that hold 50 to 90 passengers. The number of regional jets in service by legacy carriers grew from 500 jets in 2000 to over 1,700 today. The legacy carrier strategy of price-based competition was extremely successful in stimulating demand. However, the legacy carrier's extensive route structure required a large volume of passengers, and these passengers were increasingly price-sensitive as fares crept lower. This left the major carriers susceptible to increases in variable costs as their margins became dangerously thin. Now that oil prices have increased, air carriers don't have the latitude to pass along fuel surcharges to their consumers without decreasing demand dramatically. One of the ways airlines deal with variable cost increases is through consolidation. We'll examine one specific merger, that of Delta and Northwest, to see how airlines expect to increase revenues and reduce costs. Now, the logic behind consolidation is simple. Airlines want to remove duplicate capacity. So let's look at a simple example to see how this works. Pretend there are two airlines each flying from Dallas to Atlanta. Every day there are 2,000 passengers willing to fly, and tickets cost $50. Delta Airlines would offer 8 flights, and at $8,000 per flight, this would cost them $64,000. Northwest, on the other hand, would offer 6 flights, and this would cost them $48,000. Together, the two airlines would run 14 flights at a total cost of $112,000. Since there are 2,000 passengers each willing to pay $50 per ticket, the total revenue would be $100,000. So put together, the two airlines would lose $12,000 each day. However, if the two airlines were able to combine and only fly 11 flights, the capacity would stay the same and the cost would be reduced. The airlines would only spend $88,000 flying the 11 flights, and revenues would stay the same at $100,000, leading to a $12,000 profit. What we'll see is that the Delta-Northwest merger actually isn't focused on consolidation. Delta and Northwest have very few overlapping routes, so they're expecting to increase revenues and reduce costs in other ways. However, this type of consolidation is usually what airlines want to accomplish when they do merge. The merger of Delta and Northwest would combine the third and sixth largest air carriers into the United States' biggest airline. The deal would be an all-stock transaction worth over $17 billion. Each Northwest shareholder would receive 1.25 Delta shares for each share of Northwest they own. The combined airline would have an aggregate annual revenue of over $35 billion. It would also operate a fleet of over 800 aircraft and employ 75,000 individuals. Delta and Northwest believe they will save over $1 billion annually as a combined entity. Since they won't be removing duplicate capacity, these savings will have to come from other areas. Delta and Northwest believe they can better allocate their aircraft to a more comprehensive and diverse route structure as a combined entity. They also expect to save on overhead costs and achieve greater operational efficiency. The airlines believe the merger will have a one-time cost of $1 billion, and that the two airlines will have a combined liquidity of over $7 billion after the deal is consummated. To evaluate whether or not Delta will be able to realize these cost savings, we need to scrutinize the deal much more closely. To do this, we'll evaluate the merger from the perspective of the Department of Justice. Ultimately, the Department of Justice has the final say over whether or not a merger like this is approved or declined. We'll evaluate the merger using the Department of Justice's specific criteria for airlines. This way, we can see whether or not Delta and Northwest can reasonably achieve the cost savings that they claim. To do this, let's start by going through a brief review of the Department of Justice's regulatory process, and then look at the Delta-Northwest merger in greater detail. The Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice are charged with enforcing Section 7 of the Clayton Act that deals with acquisitions and decreases in competition. The Department of Justice has the primary responsibility for reviewing mergers in the airline industry. When they evaluate mergers, the Department of Justice is primarily concerned about reductions of competition in the applicable markets, so they'll scrutinize mergers where the two entities have overlapping routes much more carefully. Along the way, the Department of Transportation will provide the Department of Justice with data, policy input, and recommendations on whether or not to allow the merger to proceed. Since the Department of Justice considers airline mergers to be horizontal, it has three main questions it seeks to answer when evaluating potential acquisitions. First, will the combined entity have undue pricing power? Second, will the combined entity be able to reduce the number of competitors in the industry? And third, will the combined entity have too much concentration in the given markets in which it operates? Now, what this means is that the Department of Justice will give extra scrutiny to mergers in which the airlines have duplicate or overlapping routes. Airlines can overcome this by divesting some of the duplicate assets to other competitors who will continue running flights on these routes. Also, the Department of Justice will consider whether or not the airline merger has the potential to cause other downstream mergers to occur later. If these downstream mergers would reduce the number of competitors, the Department of Justice may not approve the merger preemptively.